Okay, Sekou, so we're here on the dog days. It's August 9th. To me, I've always felt the NBA has had the quickest doldrum period of the four major sports. It really is only this month, maybe 5 to 6 weeks. It can stretch into September there, but everything will get rolling again. Big difference from, say, the NFL, where maybe not this summer with that Deflategate thing, but usually hear nothing about football for months on end. Basketball, different story, just a couple weeks on the calendar year when it's all on the back burner. Yet, talks are that in the coming seasons or in the near future, probably when the next labor deal is up, that the NBA season will be stretched out so that way it starts earlier, ends later, possibly even July. Gives teams more rest during the season and at the same time shrinks this doldrum period we're talking about. Where do you come on down on that? Do you think that's a good idea at all?
Well, having covered the league for as long as I have, I would love to see the season start later. I really would. I think, to butt heads with football at every level, and I'm talking Pop Warner all the way up to the NFL, it doesn't allow the season to kick off in earnest the way I'd like to see it. I think a few years ago when we had the Christmas kickoff after the last work stoppage, that was kind of my ideal scenario where you use Christmas Day as kind of a launching pad for the season. And it gives diehard sports fans, people who love all sports, football, basketball, whatever, it gives them a chance to really lock in and focus on the NBA and the start of the NBA season on a day like Christmas when you got these awesome marquee games. Instead of them trying to keep up with multiple sports, in late September, early October when training camps are cranking up. And, and you half your eyeballs are on your fantasy football team, and, half the eyeballs are on
baseball playoffs,
baseball playoffs, what have you. It's just a lot of competing interests when the season starts now. So, yeah, I think some tweaks would be potentially a really good move.
Yeah, it's funny, though, because it's interesting you mentioned that 2012 lockout season. I know the regular season play, like the quality of play, especially early on, was a little sloppy. But I remember Bill Simmons, I believe, brought this up during that season. I actually loved it because there were so many games in such a short period of time that there was just, sometimes more is better. And in that sense, less was more because you're right. Everything started on Christmas. Christmas, the only thing that's going on really is early in the hockey season. And once again, it's like that's sort of like diehard basketball fans, diehard hockey fans. Only the diehards of each sport watch, early season matchups, really. But the NBA, when it did get rolling that year on Christmas, it was sloppy, but there was just so much action. And I thought by the time the playoffs rolled around, it seemed maybe it's because the Celtics had a good season that year. And I mentioned I'm a Celtics fan, but I was personally more in tune with that season than I had been in any season in the last 15 years.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were. I think that there's something about having the stage to yourself and the exclusivity of something like a Christmas Day, which the NBA has always done Christmas Day, to me, as well as any sport does kind of a tentpole day in their season. Because they find these great matchups. The games are spaced out basically from for East Coasters to West Coasters starting early that day. If you live in California, you get to wake up on Christmas morning, tear open some gifts, eat a little, breakfast, and there's games on. They're playing in Madison Square Garden or Boston or somewhere before you can wipe the sleep out of your eyes, And it goes all day and all night across the country, nothing but marquee matchups. You get to see the best players, the biggest names, the biggest stages. All that. I think it's just it's an ideal way to kick off your season if you're the NBA, and it allows you to do so at a time of year when the sports landscape is shifting from one thing to the other. And of course, the schedule makers have it, they do yeoman's work every year, obviously pulling all this stuff together. But that to me becomes your real golden day if you're the NBA, is that you get to crank things up on the biggest holiday of the year.
Yeah, I remember mentioning this Mark D'Amico had on the show a few weeks ago. Usually Christmas Day, Maybe it's because we're, even split further away from our families anymore, and we're such materialistic now in society. Usually Christmas Day sucks, right? You open up the present, and then there's nothing to do. So it is good that there is a good slew of basketball games on. But it's funny that there's all these suggestions, and you're talking really about, in a way, shortening the season. We're starting it later. And I would, in a way, like the season a little bit shorter. I don't think we need the full 82. And I would like a later start as well. But I think that if we can everything that we do discuss, these tweaks, and we can even get into something like about the conferences later on, which I know is a big discussion. Me, personally, I think the fundamental issue with the NBA right now, and there's not many because the product, I think, is as good as it's been since the 80s in terms of the talent and whatever. I think the fundamental issue with the NBA is the regular season really just doesn't mean that much, especially to certain teams. I know the San Antonio Spurs are sort of the prime example. And if you stretch out the season, give teams even more rest, and then we can even get into the stuff like pretty much eradicating the conferences and going 1 to 16. If you do things like that, I think that dilutes the NBA regular season even more and makes these matchups on Christmas Day that are, yes, very intriguing, but don't hold the same luster as, say, the NFL if you want to use like those Brady, Peyton Manning midseason matchups or Bears, Packers, or Red Sox, Yankees, or whatnot. I feel like the NBA doesn't have that, and do you agree with me on that?
I will be honest with you. I disagree that the regular season doesn't mean as much. Having been at the Spurs Pelicans season finale in New Orleans this past season, where the Spurs basically played their way out of chasing another championship. They got their heads handed to them by a Pelicans team that had to have that game to get into playoffs, and change the entire fortunes of the Western Conference playoffs, because San Antonio slips down to 6th instead of, finishing 2nd or 3rd. And it prevented the Warriors from even having to deal with them. It changed the entire landscape of the playoffs. So I think when we're comparing sports, it's so difficult to put the NFL season in context compared to the NBA because you only have those 16 regular season games in the NFL. So there is a much different focus when you have so few games. The NBA, people look at it and say, well, these games don't mean much because it's a, Tuesday night game in January that, right now means nothing. And who knows what it might mean come the middle of April. And the NBA schedule, to me, requires you to connect the dots a little bit as the season wears on, because you have to decide, does, this Sunday afternoon game between two teams that at the time might not be on a collision course for anything, but say in the conference finals, they meet up, and you look back and say, well, does that game that they played, 4 months ago have any bearing on what we see now in this series, maybe? And I point to a game years ago. I was covering Indiana Pacers, and they played the Detroit Pistons in a regular season game right after Detroit had traded for Rasheed Wallace. And it was the first time those two teams, who had been combatants in the East, they were fighting it out for the top spot in the East. It was the first time they'd seen each other in the form that they would both have come playoff time. And Detroit just manhandled the Pacers. Rasheed made a huge difference. You could tell, having him change the dynamic of how those two teams matched up. And it didn't, nobody said anything at the time. You didn't think, oh, well, this means that when they see each other in the conference finals or whatever, this will be the precursor to what we watch when everything's on the line. But that's exactly what happened. And I think if you can't use the context of the entire season to gauge what's going to happen when seasons are on the line come playoff time, then it makes it more difficult to appreciate all the little nooks and crannies of an 82-game season. But if you look at it through that different perspective, I think it all makes sense in a larger scope.
But this is where I'm going to have to retort with you. I mean, you can definitely bring up singular examples. Obviously that's last game of the year, and then there's sort of message games that have always been sent, and you can use back in 2004, the Pistons and the Pacers, when they were clearly going to meet in the Eastern Conference Finals that year. But what I really mean is when you use the NFL, it's like, oh, there's only 16 games. Yes, but if you have these long extended postseasons in the NBA, as you do in the NBA, the NFL, in the regular season, it's 16 games, but you're playing for first-round buys. You're playing for one game at home. The NBA doesn't have that. Like, if the NBA had first-round buys, as people forget, they used to for, like, I want to say 10 years, back in the 70s and early 80s, if you won the division. And Philadelphia and Boston, everyone remembers those great playoff series they had in the early 80s. I think they met 3 out of 5 years or something like that. And even I think they met back in 77, before the Bird era. People forget they had these amazing playoff series, but they had unbelievable regular season games. And I remember, I think it was 81, the last game of the year, was like a bloodbath because whoever won that game won the Atlantic Division. And winning the Atlantic Division now, or any other division in the NBA, it's sort of like, yeah, we win a division. Some teams actually hang banners for it, which is just utterly idiotic and just, boorish. But back then, it was the difference between, A, getting home court advantage in the conference finals when the two teams met, and then skipping a week of playoff basketball and having to play a team like Atlanta for 3 games in the first round where you could lose. I mean, it's only a 3-game series. All it takes is to lose 1 game at home and then go down there and get tripped up in 2 games, and you're done in a matter of days. You just sort of don't see that, and we use the San Antonio Spurs. If you want to use that as an example, I mean, I know you know very well a couple years ago, big rematch of the NBA Finals on TNT was Spurs-Miami, and Greg Popovich said, yeah, huge game, huh? They were all sitting, and that was just a complete waste, and you had people from Miami complaining. They wasted all this money, paying big money for an NBA Finals rematch tickets. Not many people watched on TV, and that's sort of where I come down on that.
I know, but that was a great game, if you remember. The Boris Diaw-led Spurs.
No one's going to watch that. It doesn't hold any implications, though. It turned into a preseason game.
Well, if you want to assume foolishly, as a lot of people did, that by sitting those starters, the Spurs were going to get beat by 40, yeah, but that's not what happened, and that's exactly my point. There's context that you only get from a season with hindsight. If you go into a season knowing that this matchup of these two teams at this time will result in a bloodbath, well, yeah, you could disregard it 80 to 90% of every season in every sport. I mean, I got a kid in high school who plays football at his high school. We know going in, we know their schedule, at the end of last season, we knew what the schedule would be this fall. And if we knew what every team would look like based on projections, I'd skip half his season. But it's athletic competition, and you don't know what the outcome might be. You don't know how it's going to play out. So therefore, you can't really disregard it on theory. You have to actually watch the games and see what happens. I think, we sometimes take for granted that every sport will be like football. And I mean NFL football, which is the NFL's hierarchy is largely determined long before anybody ever hits the field. When's the last time you watched the NFL season and some team that was projected to be a bottom tier team shocked the world and won a Super Bowl or was one of the better teams in the league? It doesn't happen. In the NBA and basketball, it happens all the time to me. We always end up with 2 or 3 teams that weren't supposed to. I disagree
with you on that big time.
And then they end up overachieving. And I'll tell you right now, did you think the Atlanta Hawks were a 60-win team going before last season started? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the unpredictability of an NBA season, to me, lends itself to the roller coaster that is its regular season much better than you ever could in football. And that's why I said you're arguing apples and oranges when you're talking about comparing an NFL season to an NBA season. It's not a legitimate comparison.
Well, we could probably go on this almost all day. I do want to switch topics, but I actually have to disagree with you that totally. I mean, you mentioned I know Atlanta Hawks, but what about some of the teams that have come out of nowhere and have appeared in Super Bowls, have won Super Bowls? The 2001 Patriots that had Brady and everything. There was a Panthers team that made it, that Rams team when Kurt Warner went down. I got to disagree with
Listen, look, I'm a Michigan guy, so all you Boston area fans who are surprised that Tom Brady's been so successful, you guys obviously didn't pay attention to his 4 years in Ann Arbor. Tom Brady led my Michigan Wolverines back from 13 games they were down during his playing career. They came back and won. So I'm not surprised that Tommy has turned out to be one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. That's the only people surprised by that are NFL fans who didn't pay attention to Tom when he was in Ann Arbor. So I'm pushing back on anybody that thinks Tom Brady's some kind of shocker. Tommy's been winning games for a long time, and we appreciate him in Ann Arbor in ways that nobody else can.
Yeah, but I know there's so many other examples in football as well, like that Kurt Warner Rams team. But I will be on this all day. One thing I know that me and you will probably agree on is there's a lot of talk about pretty much wiping out the conferences and going 1-16. To me, this goes back to really trying to enhance the regular season. I think if you do that, it then becomes pretty much even more. If you pretty much make division games mean nothing, rivalries in interconference that really don't mean anything, I think that takes a lot of the fun out of the regular season. Once again, I think we had you on the show, what was it, back in January 4th of like 2013 or 14, where you said no way should they wipe out the conferences or see the playoffs 1-16, whatever they want to do. Do you still sort of stand by that, or have you sort of altered your opinion?
No, I mean, I just think this notion that you're going to have regional rivalries and kind of a provincial attitude about the league in the day and age on the globe instantly, to everyone. I think it's naive for me or anyone else to think that you can hang on to those traditional sensibilities about divisions. But the thing I don't like about you, saying, hey, we're going to take the top 16 no matter what. We're going to take the teams with the best records and send you in the West, the 50-win team in the West that's over there beating their head against the wall deserves to get in over this sub-500 team in the East, this, that, and the other. Well, that's the trophy. Everybody gets a trophy culture. It's like, hey, I understand that there are going to be some imperfections in a system. And it's like, if we're going to legislate it all out to be what we think is fair, then we never stop changing. And we never hold on to anything that means something, historical, in these matchups. So, I mean, I'm split. Part of me understands that you can't be married to these things when they just don't make sense anymore. But the other part of me gets frustrated when somebody says, well, Brooklyn last year, everybody's like, oh, they shouldn't have been in the playoffs. Well, yeah, they probably shouldn't. If you look at it from a holistic point of view, but there's something to be said for dealing with the set of circumstances the way they are and going into the process and understanding that, hey, it's not going to be fair. It's not going to be perfect. And you have to make the most of whatever your predicament is. Now, Phoenix Suns fans would tell you, hey, we'd get into playoffs and do a much better job than Brooklyn would in their matchup. And that may be true, but it also may not be. I mean, they could get in and get bounced in the first round in 5 games too. So the real problem for me is you're going to take a system that has forever, like you said, relied on the divisional format and how that calculates, throughout the course of a season, and you're going to ask teams to ignore that and play to the standard of, hey, I need to be one of the top 8 teams in the conference, no matter what. And once I get in, like every year in every playoff scenario, once you get in, nobody cares anymore about who finished where and what you did in your division. It's about getting in the playoffs and playing your best. And if we can get to that point in a reasonable fashion, I don't really care about the minutia of how you do it, to be honest with you.
And I actually agree with that point. And sort of one other thing as well is when you talk, let's say you replace the Brooklyn Nets or the Boston Celtics in last year's postseason with whoever's at the bottom of the West. I can't even remember at this point. Was it Phoenix? And I know Phoenix kind of got chipped a little 2 years ago. They won like 48 games or they finished. I don't know what it was. They had a good season and they couldn't.
They won 49 games and didn't get in.
Yeah, and I mean, I know it's sort of like it's unfair. But if you look at it from a black and white perspective, the Phoenix Suns in the postseason does not change the landscape of that NBA season whatsoever. It doesn't. Like the Boston Celtics being in doesn't change anything over the Phoenix Suns being in. Cleveland still would have advanced. The Warriors still would have advanced,
right,
and whatnot. And I think that if you do make this 1-16, especially if you wipe out divisions, and I used that. I'm always going to use a Boston example on the show. I'm sorry. But I used that Sixers Celtics example back in '81 in the regular season when winning the division truly meant something back in the day. I mean, I use that now, and I know people are always afraid of poor division winners getting like a home game. The NFL, I think the Seahawks went 7-9. They hosted a playoff game against the 12-4 Saints, and they beat them. But the funny thing is, nobody remembers that 4 years later. I mean, I guess I do, but you have to sort of be reminded about it. No one does, and I just don't think that it matters at the grand scheme of things. But at the same time, if you make winning your division mean something, or finishing first in your conference really means something other than home games throughout the playoffs or Game 7 on your floor, then I just think it just adds a little bit more to that regular season. And that's sort of where I come down on the regular season doesn't mean as much, at least doesn't mean as much as I would say baseball or the NFL, where you could have these huge mid-season matchups. Because if, just getting into the playoffs, and I know it hurt San Antonio last year, but I think that's a singular example. But if it's sort of just get into the playoffs, and we'll see what happens from there, if that's the way it's going to be, I think there could be a little bit more of the NBA if they had. Winning a division means something.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I'm a true believer in the fact that, you have to take a historic view of how these things work, and if all you have is singular examples in anything, I mean, that's all you have to point to in terms of, the overall picture of what you're talking about. I mean, everything is a singular example in some respect or another. And I feel like if our end game is always to crown a champion, hey, you're trying to figure out the best of the best. Nobody's going to care 10 years from now outside of a very small, specific group of people who Cleveland played in the first round. I was at the game where Kevin Love got his shoulder yanked and it ended his season, and that's significant in itself. But I'm saying Cleveland gets to the finals, they're up 2-1. They were on the verge of rendering that whole thing a footnote in their season, just a small blip of what went on in their season had they finished the deal. They didn't, obviously, and Golden State won the championship. But my point is, all of these things, all of these markers in a season, from start of training camp to the last night of the season when somebody gets a confetti shower and becomes a champion, they're all puzzle pieces that mean something to one group and means something totally different to another one, and to me, the entire mess of them jammed together is what makes each and every NBA season spectacular to me in terms of the grand scope of how all of these things are interconnected. And I think when you start looking at it from a very narrow view, and you're just worried about, and this is fandom. This is what fandom's always been about. It's about what a season looks like to this group of fans or that group of fans or this group of people. Our charge is different to me as media members and as chroniclers of the history of this game. We have to take a broader view. I can't look at it from I'm from Michigan. I can't look at it from a Pistons perspective when I'm working. I have to look at it from a larger overall perspective. You know what I mean? And I think that's the beauty and the curse of how we all look at this stuff. Everybody brings to it their own perspective of what it means and what the significance of all of these different things are when they're placed in the same context and pulled together and kind of viewed in this broader scope. And I choose not to dismiss things like who wins a division, and I know that's tough to do. But to me, that's a significant marker for certain teams when you're talking about if it's a one step in a bigger movement for that team or development of a team. I mean, I was laughing with some guys that I work with at NBA.com yesterday about 5 years ago. Had somebody told you the Golden State Warriors are going to be NBA champs in 5 years, you would have slapped them. Because for years, they've done a little more than make a playoff appearance here and there and embarrass themselves as an organization, basically. They did that for 3.5 decades. You can't plan for some of the things that occur in this game, which is which is to me one of the best things about it is you just don't know what's going to happen when the matchups get set and the playoffs come around, and the nuance of each and every game starts to unfold. And I like that about the playoffs in any sport. I love that. That's why I love that we have series and not one game scenarios in the NBA postseason, which is what makes it special to me, is that we're not relying on one-hit wonders and some team having it one night and not having it the next. And, all that. I mean, there's something to be said for the way this thing is structured, and to go about dismantling it on a whim or because the trend right now is that the West is so strong that teams who normally might be in the playoffs are not going to get that opportunity. To me, that's short-sighted to me, Larry, in a lot of ways. To me, that's looking at it from a very narrow perspective and not understanding kind of the grand scheme of how this game has played out over the years. And it's going to be, 70 years old this year. I mean, we're talking 70 years, in terms of the evolution of the NBA in this game and how it all works. And I would argue that we should be very cautious and careful in how we suggest things change going forward based on all that we've seen over the past 70 years. Yeah,
and actually the one good thing about this is the NBA, it's not like Major League Baseball where they always seem to be stuck in the 1950s. Adam Wilson's actually Adam Wilson, wow, that is about as horrendous as it gets. Adam Silver is pragmatic enough that, these are suggestions that he's actually listening to. And baseball, they always seem to ignore it. And, whenever they do something, like interleague play, they end up just completely butchering it. And the next thing you know, you have, the Red Sox opening up a season in Philadelphia or whatnot. And it's just like, okay, now you completely urinated all over that. But, basketball, they're actually willing to make these changes, and I think that's why we have so many of these discussions of what the NBA should do and what they shouldn't do. I just think that the thing that really is, it's about identifying the problem, not of what's fair and unfair or unjust or whatnot. And I just find the problem to be that I think they could actually enhance the regular season even more and maybe create more, rivalries or whatnot and make regular season matchups mean more, as I think that they just do in baseball and the NFL, largely because just getting into the playoffs is just a little more complicated. But I do want to switch topics here, because the NBA schedule, it usually comes out this time of year, and I'm actually completely, I don't know a damn thing about what's going on here with NBA and NBATV. Could you update us on when we're actually going to be able to plan our lives this coming winter?
I'm guessing that it usually comes out, the second week of August. If I go back and look at when I write that story every year about the schedule being released. So I would imagine sometime in the next few days, we'll have the schedule in our hands and everybody will have a chance to plan, their Christmas holiday. And, I'm usually on the road on Christmas Day every year and have been for the last 16, 17 years. I usually work on Christmas, which I don't mind. I love having the opportunity to be at a game on Christmas Day. But, yeah, I think it's definitely coming out here in the next few days, and people will be, probably interested to see where the Mavericks and Clippers play. What day is the Mark Cuban, DeAndre Jordan?
Christmas Day.
Oh, it's got to be. You figure it has to be on either opening night or Christmas Day.
Do it on Halloween or something, Open on Christmas Day.
I'm sure Mark Cuban would appreciate it being on Halloween. But, and opening night is always interesting. You want to me, I love to see what games are on those marquee nights, Opening night is always good to see where the defending champs, who they're playing on opening night and things like that. And then you want to know who the lineup is on Christmas. Martin Luther King Day is another huge, day for the schedule. and you kind of plan accordingly.
And NBA TV usually has a good broadcast when the schedule does come out. Obviously, it's a big thing. It's pretty much the only storyline in the month of August. But you guys do usually a pretty good job, right? When the schedule does come out. Yes,
I'm sure there'll be a show that kind of details all that stuff. And yeah, I mean, normally there wouldn't be a whole lot else going on in August, but we got USA basketball training camp coming up this week, which will be very interesting to see who shows up in Las Vegas for the mandatory. Apparently, you have to at least show up to Vegas. It doesn't mean you have to work out, but you got to be there in attendance for the meetings, I'm sure, the pep talks from Jerry Colangelo and everybody about who's going to make the trip to Rio next summer on the Olympic team. So there'll be a little more news maybe than normal in August, a little more NBA news. But a lot of it will be basic stuff, and, I'm curious to see Derrick Rose, I guess, is kind of not sure if he's going to continue to participate in the program based on the requirements that they're asking everybody to show up in Vegas. LeBron is reportedly, planning on being there at least for a day to make his appearance, because they don't, these guys aren't sure if they want to make that commitment a year in advance, based on how your season goes, based on how much basketball you will play in the calendar year between now and the Olympic process when it gets cranked up next summer. So it's going to be interesting. I think, you're talking about the elite of the elite, when you're dealing with the USA basketball, the men's senior national team. And I'm going to be curious to see who shows up out there eager for an opportunity to chase a spot on that team.
Yeah, Rio is going to be a fun trip regardless, though. I know one of my friends has been big on Olympics going to Rio. I know he's big about getting down there, so he can't wait till next year. But we've had you here for a while. I got two more questions. First one, we're talking about the schedule, so I want to keep it fun. They're still doing 5 games on Christmas. Am I correct? Is it 5?
I don't know how many they're going to do, to be honest with you. That's been the standard, but it could change. You never know.
All right, so a little prediction game. Let's say it is the 5, and they started at noon here Eastern time, and they go all the way up till 10:30. Mm-hmm. Don't have to give me the matchups, but give me the 10 teams you think that are going to play on Christmas Day.
Well, you got to have a game in Madison Square Garden. No matter if the Knicks are a dumpster fire or not, you got to have a game at the Mecca on Christmas. So you figure the Knicks.
Knicks Bulls is a popular one.
Yeah, I mean, you got to have the Knicks. You want to have your better team, so you go Knicks. And these aren't matches. I'm just
if you want to just give 10.
You want the Celtics in there if they're viable in any way, shape, or form, which I think they will be. I would make the Sixers play on Christmas just so we can see what the hell is going on.
No.
Sam Hickey's bunch. I don't care who they play. They could play the Washington Generals, but I need to see something from Philly on Christmas. Chicago is a team that usually gets one of those assignments. Cleveland, obviously. Atlanta. I think Washington needs to be in action on that day. Miami. The Clippers, Warriors, Thunder, Spurs.
Do you think the Lakers? Do you think they'll put them on Christmas Day this year? I know they've always been on, but they might bounce them out.
I'm sitting here saying in my head I'm about to say the Lakers, and then I'm going, I don't want to see the Lakers. Depends on what Kobe's status is by then, but yeah, I mean, I think the Lakers are kind of a no-brainer as a Christmas Day game as well, and the Texas teams, I guess Houston. You got the Spurs you want to see in action, but I guess Houston could be another team based on how they finished last year that you'd want in that mix as well.
Yeah, I just hope they don't turn the Lakers into the Detroit Lions on Thanksgiving if the Lakers – and I know I really just threw a cheap shot at you.
No, listen, I used to go to those games. That was our tradition growing up is the high school state championships in Michigan used to be played Thanksgiving weekend, and they still are, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't lived home in 20 years, but the tradition was the state championships were played on one day, and then the Lions played on Thanksgiving, and you used to ask yourself, could the team that just won the state championship compete with the Lions. So it's understandable.
And then the question would be if they could compete with the Cowboys, who was equally just annoying. You'd always see Dallas, like the 1 o'clock or the 12:30 game, whatever time was Detroit. And then it's like, oh, what's the second game? Oh, Dallas is playing the Redskins. Like, oh, my goodness, this isn't worth my time. But you mentioned, I got to get you out of here. You mentioned Kobe, what his status was. There's been some talk about this could possibly be his last year. I think this is the last year of that contract extension he signed.
Yes.
It was almost 2 years ago now, where everyone was just sort of scratching their heads.
Yes.
Do you think this is going to be it for Kobe?
No.
You don't?
I mean, I guess he could come back and have a monster year. Theoretically, you say, if he comes back and just plays out of his mind. I don't know physically if he's going to be able to do that. And I can't imagine Kobe going out on bended knee. You know what I mean? I can't see him walking away from his career without having had a chance to have a Kobe-like season where he's going to go out and average 20 plus and be on a team that's competing for something more than just to get out of the worst position in the lottery. And they're not going to be a playoff team this year by anybody's stretch of imagination in the West. So I just cannot for the life of me see Kobe going out like that. I feel like if he has to play on a 1-year deal, the season after this one, just so he can finish up his career the way he wants, I could see him doing it. And I say that only because the competitor that he's been throughout the course of his career doesn't suggest he would be a guy who walks away with his head hanging, with his tail between his legs. It's just, I would imagine that Kobe has ambitions that far exceed anything we meaning the general public, feel is possible for a guy at his age, this stage of his career, with the bumps, bruises, and injuries he's dealt with here recently. I think all of us have a diminished expectation for what Kobe will do for the remainder of his career. And if his track record is any indication, he thinks we're nuts. You know what I mean? We're idiots for doubting him, and his mission is to prove it.
Yeah, and I don't think Kobe, and I'm with you, I don't think it's his last year either. I don't think Kobe's going to go out with, oh, by the way, I'm retiring right now. I think he's going to get the grand Cal Ripken,
yes,
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, send away where he's getting, ceremonies at other team stadiums and whatnot.
Yes.
Maybe besides Denver. I don't think that'll happen. But you're right, I don't see that. But I think what will be interesting to watch, because I know Mitch Kupchak had something to say. Obviously the Lakers need a youth movement, so it'll be kind of peculiar if Kobe's going to come back and ask for some sort of 1-year extension. I mean, I wonder if there could be a hardball game with the Lakers, of all things.
The thing I can't wrap my head around is Kobe finishing his career in a uniform other than the Lakers.
Right, like the Knicks or something.
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, like, say things go awry this year in L.A., which is very possible. Could Kobe switch for one final season and go somewhere else and chase the glory somewhere else? And I'm just like, I don't know where he'd do that. And I don't know if his ego would allow that. For him to, I know Los Angeles would hate it. I know I got relatives in there all over LA and in Southern California. When I tell you that they are Kobe sycophants to the extreme, that's an understatement.
Oh,
I can't imagine them stomaching. Yeah, I can't see how they would survive if Kobe goes somewhere else and plays, and then has a great season somewhere else. Like, say he goes to, and just throw a team out there.
I think the Knicks would be.
Yeah, say he goes to New York somewhere and has and helps them turn things around. So it would be a dagger to the heart of my friends and family that live in Southern California to see Kobe do that elsewhere.
Good way to get you out of there on that, Sekou. So happy we could finally make it happen. It's been a while since we've had you on the show. Sekou Smith, NBA.com and NBATV. You can follow Sekou on Twitter at Sekou Smith NBA. Once again, so happy we finally made this one happen.
Yeah, man. Always good to argue basketball with people, man. Love it.
All right. Sekou Smith, NBA.com. We'll be back after a few words.